If you look inside the autocratic camp, for example, you also don't even find this discussion about how important autocracy or dictatorship is. They have their own political systems, whether we like those systems or not, but they're being pretty pragmatic about developing their economies and pursuing their national interests. And they don't even talk about this democracy, autocracy. So I don't think it really makes sense. And if anything, I don't go into further detail here, but if anything, I think it's even counterproductive for Washington to be doubling down in this very argument of autocracy versus democracy.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm joined today again by Yauheni Preiherman. Yauheni is a Belarusian national and the founder and director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. He holds a PhD in politics and international studies from Warwick University, and we know each other from our work for the Austrian Institute for Peace. Yauheni recently wrote an insightful article with the title "Designing a New Cold War of Our Preference, a Catch-22 Problem." We will discuss his arguments now. So, Yauheni, thank you very much for coming online again.
Thank you for inviting me again. I'm a big fan of Neutrality Studies, so it's a great pleasure.
Thanks for that. Well, we're not so much going to talk about neutrality now, but more about the argument you're trying to make in this article, which, if I understand it correctly, you want to say, look, there's nothing inevitable about this new Cold War, and actually the new is not even that, the Cold War is not even a very good metaphor to kind of grasp what's going on currently. And you start off, like, very interestingly by highlighting the security dilemma and Robert Jervis' famous dictum that the central theme of international relations is not evil, but tragedy. Could you explain what you mean with that?
Well, I always thought, as a student of international relations, that this dictum and sort of the centuries of analysis that stand behind the dictum should be self-evident to at least those people that deal with international relations and those who take decisions these days. But it turns out they are not. And perhaps it's always easier for us, in our analytical sits and with our academic gowns to look at things in calm rooms and be critical about decision makers. But I think, we still should be, even though I understand how much pressure and burden all those decision makers are facing. And what I wanted to say in this article, I guess the main point I wanted to make is that instead of focusing on, personalities in today's international relations, everyone is worried, at least in the West, about Putin, about Xi. And then you go to Moscow, it's a lot of talk about how bad Biden is and all other personalities. But I think, it's at the very least a waste of our time when we focus on those personalities, because I think it's pretty obvious that there are some structural, objective, if you will, mechanics that are behind certain developments, and we're observing those developments. And the security dilemma has proven time and time again to be one of those driving mechanics. And I think it is pretty obvious it's playing out right as we speak again. And perhaps for the viewers of Neutrality Studies, we don't need to go into much detail about security dilemma, but just to remind you a brief idea about that is security dilemma refers to this phenomenon in international relations whereby everyone thinks what they are doing, states think what they do is defensive. They want to ensure that they protect themselves, especially against all sorts of contingencies that might be out there. But then when they, for instance, build up on their military capabilities, which they think are defensive, that sends a very wrong signal, or at least this is perceived in a way by the other sides as potentially offensive. So the other side, when seeing those preparations, also thinks that they need to start preparing for potential negative contingencies for their own security. And that leads to what we call the security spiral. And in this article, I don't just talk about the military side of this. I'm making a point that I think we're already past the point where the security dilemma, attributional attitude towards your opponents or, let's say, others in international relations has penetrated pretty much a lot in our lives, politically, economically. And I think when we look at the debates internationally today, the debates on the key geopolitically important countries, you see that as well. It's all about, the mean negative intentions by the others. And at a certain point, I think those discussions, they no longer come together. They live in parallel worlds. And I think that's the most dangerous that you can get with the security dilemma and wrong approaches to dealing with the security dilemma. And what I wanted to stress specifically in this article is that, if we are attentive to this phenomenon of security dilemma, there is something it can tell us in a practical way. And the most important thing it tells us is that no matter how we think the other side is wrong, mean intended, how much, it wants to destroy us or destroy the world we like, the only way out of the security spiral, and the security spiral, if we don't stop it, quite hypothetically might lead to the end of the world. I mean, given that we have the nuclear weapons there. So the only way to somehow tame the security dilemma is to start doing something in a cooperative and coordinated way. And what I meant with this article was a response to a previous commentary by the director of the European Leadership Network, Sir Adam Thompson, who actually brought up this discussion: what kind of new Cold War do we want to have? And he was basically arguing that it is high time we started thinking about the parameters of this new Cold War we want to have and how to control the escalation, how to manage it. So I was answering to him is that, given the security dilemma phenomenon, the only way to manage the confrontation is to start coordinating our approaches. And if we just do it single-handedly, unilaterally, or let's say with our allies, that doesn't look very promising, because we'll always be lagging behind with our own unilateral intellectual designs behind the intellectual dilemma, which will be, pushing the confrontation further and further.
Yeah, and as I understand it, I mean, you're on the one hand, you're kind of arguing that Cold War is not even the right way of kind of conceptualizing what's going on currently, because the differences between the first Cold War and what's going on now are huge, right? Even just when it comes to ideology. We're not in this ideological dilemma anymore. We have like slightly different kind of ideological dichotomies. Maybe you can talk about those. But the second point then is that even if we think of it as a Cold War, we would need to realize that the reason why the first Cold War didn't lead to our annihilation was because some form of coordination between the superpowers started happening, especially after 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a wake-up call to the goddamn danger of not having a hotline between each other, right? And right now, we are still in the phase where we are trying to actively burn down bridges, right? We are still seeing more and more like things that still connect us collapse. And your argument is that is very dangerous, right?
Well, that's true. And, to start with the very end of my article, I'm also trying to show that what we are doing today is pretty much meaningless given the security dilemma mechanics, because the only way to prevent us from annihilating ourselves in the end will be to start coordinating our actions and to start coordinating our de-escalation. In other words, even if we continue doing what we are doing, which is, just going more and more into this confrontation and trying to double down on our efforts to confront the other side, which of course has little to do with any coordination, cooperation. There are only two alternatives out of this very, flow of developments and events. One is that we do arrive at a point where we have a nuclear Armageddon and we annihilate ourselves, or we still arrive at a crisis, perhaps even of the magnitude of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the only way out would be to start coordinating de-escalation. So in a way, we're only wasting time and we're playing, with high risks right now if we continue doing what we are doing and don't start, talking to each other in a cooperative manner, which we'll have to do at some point later. But then going back to the new Cold War discussion and the argument I was making there. Well, first of all, let me stress that wasn't the main part of the article. So I only offered a very sketchy, very brief discussion of this argument. But indeed, what I argue is that, first of all, we of course don't know for certain right now. Where we are at this point, to use the language of historical institutionalists, could probably be called a period of critical disjuncture. So we know that the previous international system, the way we knew it, like this unipolar moment, which emerged after the Cold War was over. So that period is over as well. We are most probably moving towards a more multipolar system. We also can talk about the dominating powers, which are the US and China, and we can, have quite a few ideas about where it goes next. Most probably we can be certain about some of those ideas. But at the same time, before we arrive at a critical juncture, again, to use this term from historical institutionalists, we cannot be certain. And in a way, when we talk about the Cold War, we always refer to something stable, to the stable system which existed out there. But we also, of course, need to remember that it didn't emerge out of nowhere and out of nothing, right? And there were at least a few years after the end of the Second World War when things did not look as certain. And, it was only in the late 1940s that critical juncture happened, which for the next several decades basically made sure that the world developed the way it did. And as we also know, quite a lot of people who were intellectual architects of a lot of things which happened back then did not think that those developments were inevitable. And of course, I'm referring, for instance, to George Kennan, who, as a lot of people now say, spent a few years of his life trying to design this Cold War with, of course, his famous Mr. X article and a couple of other things. And then he spent the rest of his life, several more decades, trying to basically explain to the world that those things had not been inevitable and that there were ways to at least minimize the risks. So I think it's important just to remind those developments today, right?
And he spent the last part of his life warning us and cautioning us that if we are not careful, then we will land in exactly the situation that we have now. George Kennan belonged to the people who said, if you try to push Ukraine into NATO, there will be another war. And sure enough, there is a war. So we have this problem, right, that you have the early Cold Warriors, who are all people who came to political maturity shortly before and during the Second World War. Then those people are in charge of the first 20 years of the Cold War or so. And during that period, we have another generation of people coming of age, the second part called warriors in both East and West. And those are the people who started de-escalating and for 20 years worked towards solving the conundrum, right? And I'm talking about people on the one hand like Mikhail Gorbachev, and on the other hand like Jack Matlock, the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. And there's a whole slate of people who in the 70s, 80s, and 70s and 80s worked toward ending the Cold War. And Mr. Matlock never gets tired of saying it's a stupid idea to think of the U.S. having won the Cold War because the Cold War was ended by negotiation in 1989. The collapse of the Soviet Union only happened 2 years later, connected but different dynamic. And the Cold War was ended by negotiation and through mutual agreement, right? And then we all thought we reached the end of history. 30 years go by, and now we are in a situation where the people in the driving seats of power came to maturity during the 1990s and 2000s. Their political careers came to maturity in that period, or they were formed largely in that period. And now we are again in a highly confrontative situation, and in a situation where we create these parallel universe narratives. And you talked about that too, right? The bubbles, the information or the thought bubbles. Can you briefly maybe explain how you perceive those bubbles, being somebody who's able to travel to both of them?
Well, I think that's more or less, typical situation given what kind of previous history we have. And I agree. What you said is important that unlike before the original Cold War, and again, I don't think what we are entering should be called a new Cold War just because there are a couple of differences, and I still need to explain what those differences are, and I'll do that in a moment. But that's important. So the generation of politicians which are in the driving seats today is definitely different from the post-Second World War generation, many of whom saw the atrocities and hostilities with their own eyes. Even though, and I think it's also important to emphasize this, when we read memoirs, from the Cuban Missile Crisis years, for example, and when we see how many people in the surrounding of President Kennedy were actually trying to convince him that the only way out of that situation was to use nuclear weapons, doesn't really matter how they saw that. Of course, they were not talking about going for all of it just at once. There were probably some graduations they wanted to pass, but just imagine. So even back then, with all those people who witnessed the tragedy of a real world war and still arguing that the only way out would be to use nuclear weapons because the US considered itself to be much stronger than the USSR back then. So if we project that situation in the decision-making rooms onto what we are having today, I find it really difficult to sleep at night when I think what kind of discussions might be taking place right now behind the closed doors, or as John Bolton recently titled his book, "In the Room Where It Happened," in the room where it is happening, right? And especially since we're more and more into this phenomenon of parallel worlds, which indeed I touched upon in the article. And right, I still have an opportunity to travel between those two worlds and to meet people, including those who are very close to decision making in Moscow and in Western capitals. And I think already back like 6-7 years ago, those looked like echo chambers rather than anything else. And it was back then that my organization, the Minsk Dialogue Council and International Relations, was trying to create this platform in Minsk where, at least some kind of discussion beyond the echo chambers could take place. And at some point, we thought we were succeeding in this. But of course, now that we're having what we are having, of course, that did not work out. So now the question is becoming even more problematic. What do you do with this? How do you handle a situation where it's not only that the two parallel bubbles exist, but there are very few people inside both of those bubbles who really even understand that they need to look for ways to come out of the bubbles. They might be driven by all sorts of rationale, be it political or intellectual. Perhaps they also think that, the stronger and the harsher they are towards the other side, the more of a deterrence effect this is going to have, and the more this is going to lead to a situation like what the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis was. But especially when by the way, which is sometimes surprising to me, when I talk to the military on both sides of this divides, most of them tell me that, okay, we have all the instruments available to control confrontation. Don't worry about that. We can double down on our sort of rhetoric, which is anti the other side. We can double down on certain things where we break the arms control instruments, we break transparency and security building mechanisms, because we still control things. I'm not sure about that. And I keep telling them that, if anything, the theory of conflict and the history, if we read what people revealed about sometimes unknown facts about former crises, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if we read all of that, in no way does it point that things can be kept under control, even when you have all that technology available. So that, of course, something which worries me, and it might sound a little bit banal, and it does return us to certain periods in the past in history. I mean, where in different sort of circumstances, historical circumstances, people still face the very same dilemmas. And in a way, they are simple, as I put it a few minutes ago. It's basically either we're moving towards a point where we need to de-escalate together, or we're going to pass this threshold and we are entering a complete new era where the nuclear weapon has been used, not only in Japan, like it happened at the end of the Second World War.
Weapons.
Yeah. So that these things are, of course, very dangerous. And now, sorry for jumping from topic to topic, but if you still want me to quickly address the question why it's not perhaps too helpful to think in Cold War terms about what is happening right now, I'll do it quickly. So in the article, I basically singled out two main factors. The first one is ideological, of course. I mean, a lot of people now are trying to present what's going on in ideological terms. From the Americans, you hear this increasing narrative, this is democracy versus autocracy. When you go to Moscow, what you hear, perhaps not as emphatically as you hear the ideological argument in the West, but still, you do hear it in Moscow as well. It's a struggle between the traditional values, which Moscow wants to represent and to fight for, and postmodernistic values, as a lot of people in Russia would put it. In China, I'm not a China expert, but as far as I can judge by what I read and what I see, there is a little bit of a similarity to this Moscow-Russian discussion as well. But I think if we just compare today in this respect, in this ideological respect, to this all-encompassing, overarching confrontation between communism and capitalism, today just fades in comparison to those days, because back in those days, what was peculiar about that confrontation in an ideological sense was that two universal ideologies were struggling, two expansive ideologies were struggling, ideologies which did present a certain worldview. And of course, when you look at the countries today, even if you want to apply this democracy, autocracy lenses to analyze what's going on, it doesn't match the reality, because you see a lot of countries in this democratic world which are happily cooperating with the countries in the autocratic world, especially when it comes to all sorts of energy resources. And we're not talking about Russia right now, which used to be the argument in the past. Look at the countries in the Middle East and how enthusiastic European leaders are about developing those relations. If you look inside the autocratic camp, for example, you also don't even find this discussion about how important autocracy or dictatorship is. They have their own political systems, whether we like those systems or not, but they're being pretty pragmatic about developing their economies and pursuing their national interests. And they don't even talk about this democracy, autocracy. So I don't think it really makes sense. And if anything, I don't go into further detail here, but if anything, I think it's even counterproductive for Washington to be doubling down in this very argument of autocracy versus democracy.
The big question I have is whether the people who use this kind of rhetoric, whether they actually believe the BS that they propagate. Because especially when it comes for Western propaganda and this autocracy versus democracy dichotomy, which is so clearly, utterly, totally untrue. It's just so easy to disprove that the West somehow cares very much about democracies just by looking at who they collaborate with. But also on the other side, the US has had a very close alliance with Saudi Arabia. That one seems to be breaking down as we speak. But still, like Egypt, first democratically elected president dies in prison, and Washington is quite happy about that, and really happy to work with 𝗟𝗪𝗧 and so on. I mean, we have example over example over example, and also the human rights discourse. I completely understand how China and Russia don't take the West serious when the US and the West, Europe, just ignores the Palestinians. I mean, they only care about the Muslim rights in Xinjiang, Muslim rights in Palestine are basically now, we don't know of anything, and they keep blocking this, right? I mean, this whole discourse is so utterly hypocritical that I wonder whether the people actually believe in it. But on the other hand, we also have all of these counterexamples, right? I mean, Mongolia I never get tired of mentioning that one. It's like a democracy that over the last 30 years has been developing beautifully and very well. There's still issues to tackle, and corruption is still there, but in terms of democratization and of peaceful transition of power, works like a charm, works basically like a Western European multi-party a parliamentary democracy. And China and Russia don't care. They don't mind. They are not going to invade and install like a dictator there, because they don't care, because Mongolia plays along, like in terms of like between Russia and China, and also in the region. So this dichotomy, at least on the West, makes no sense. I wonder whether you're seeing similar hypocrisies in like the Russian narrative about postmodernism versus conservatism.
Well, I guess I do, even though what the Russians are doing with this narrative is more responsive, reactive to this narrative coming from the West. And I don't think that a lot of people in Russia, even those who come up with these narratives and who are in charge of intellectually shaping this confrontation, are particularly happy about this. But I think they tend to believe they need to respond. They need to come up with some kind of counter narrative. And that's why this is their way of responding. But if anything, the first thing you hear in Russia from those who think about foreign relations is that they are trying to be realists. And I'm sure not everyone who says he's a realist understands what it actually means. But the first thing it should mean is that you don't pay too much attention to all this ideological, intellectual, and constructivist, if you will, ideas, because if anything, it's more about constructivism when you're trying to provide an ideological platform for all your actions. But if you're a realist, you look at quite a few other things, right? And that's why I think intuitively they still think that this is more a necessity to respond than a real need. And that's why if they can drop this part with, which is half ideological, I'll put it this way, they're happy to talk about other things. But if they can't, they develop the discourse. And there is a little bit of this philosophical demand, I would say, from people who are not so much into foreign relations and international relations, but rather, in designing senses and narratives that they would put it, who are driving this trend. And of course, the further we go, the more we'll get of that. That will be quite counterproductive as well. And Russia or any other country, China, if they double down on this, will also need to be hypocritical about this, because what we know about great power politics, when it is at full play, it is by default more realistic than anything else. And by default, those countries will need to pay attention to the balance of power, to how they advance their national interest, no matter what their ideological answers might tell us. And that's exactly what we saw, by the way, in the Cold War. So in this respect, the Cold War is very instructive and helpful in understanding things.
It is. That I agree. The only concern I have is that there is a point when ideology becomes so powerful that people start believing in it. They start believing their own lies, because at some point you need ideology in order to kind of whip up your local population, right? And whip them behind you and frame what they're seeing, which is also why the European Union and the US, they forbade RT and Sputnik and so on. I mean, you need to constrain the information space. Russia does the same, and China too. And you need to whip people into the same line of thinking, right? But at some point, if the people or the powers in the people in power and the ones doing the decisions also start believing these narratives, then it becomes a greater ideological conflict and might be become unstoppable. And I think that's exactly that's your worry, right?
True. Even though I'm more worried about these parallel realities making the security dilemma even worse, and aggravating the security dilemma rather than aggravating the ideological beliefs as such. Because in terms of just ideological beliefs, as I said a second ago, I think the history of Cold War, the original Cold War, is pretty interesting and instructive. You can find a lot of examples there, both in the Soviet behavior and the American behavior, when even at the height of this ideological, real universal confrontation, policymakers show determination to be pragmatic and practical. So that's why the security dilemma is more dangerous than this. And to give you one favorite example of mine, I recently finished reading a wonderful book about American policy towards the former Yugoslavia during the Cold War times. I mean, it's unbelievable. What do you find there if you look at all the nuances of how that policy from Washington towards Belgrade developed? Because at a point, Yugoslavia was even more advanced in terms of its ideological apparatus than the Soviet Union per se. Tito was doubling down on his ideological communist hat. He was shooting American airplanes. He was doing horrible things to not just American diplomats on his ground, but also, the Yugoslav-born employees of American embassies. Something you cannot imagine even today. A lot of people say horrible things are happening, but those were even more impressive. And then still a few years later, you see the United States basically becoming an ally of Yugoslavia. Of course, that's a separate discussion with non-alignment and everything else. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of how things might change when states come to the conclusion that ideology does not help, and it's basically a hurdle in the way of pursuing their national interests. So that's why I'm not too much worried about the ideology. I'm worried that it makes a lot of people waste their time, right? But as I said, again, to stress it, I'm more worried about the more mechanical and automatic sometimes security dilemma, because that one is more difficult to stop. And that leads us directly to military consequences.
Right. And the way out of that is, of course, to recognize and actually to start working on the idea that my security depends on your security too. Once you feel secure, I will start feeling secure, and that's the way out of that dilemma. Then you get into a positive spiral.
Absolutely, and also to add to this, and that is actually the second part of my argument why the new Cold War metaphor is not helpful, is because structurally the world is very different today. And, when you look at the current discussions in the media and among analysts, a lot of people, when their thinking is being shaped by this new Cold War metaphor, they are trying to imagine how they are going to contain and deter the other side. So they're immediately into this kind of thinking. But because structurally the world is different, it's no longer just, two superpowers. You at least have, it's becoming multipolar. And even in terms of great power politics, you currently have, at least currently, it might change, of course, but you currently have what people call two dyads of that confrontation, right? One is between Russia and the West, and the other one is between, I would even say, the US and China. And this is an important emphasis, US and China, because we recently saw Macron's visit to China. Yeah, and how it is playing out. I'm not sure Macron will be able to be our modern de Gaulle, right, and carry this burden further. He is too vulnerable right now. But if anything, it shows even in the Western world that there are structural differences that might play out. But even beyond that, indeed, the world is probably getting more multipolar. And this is not just only about, having regional powers, which are really strong and really important in their own regions. But even if you look at the nuclear power factor, right, we're in a different situation than we used to be back then with, 5 or 6, 7 countries, like 5 official nuclear powers and 2, 3 unofficial back then. Now we're clearly moving to a different reality. And that is going to, have some impacts on the developments.
I would argue that we are going to be in a nuclear version of the 19th century with the concert of powers and a balance, hopefully, rather than a Cold War. Yauheni, that was very interesting. Thank you very much for taking the time, and we'll talk soon again.
Thank you. Great pleasure. A lot to discuss. As we see, the world is very turbulent in the most classical, original meaning of this word. So I hope there will be other occasions. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. and let's hope we go back to stability. Yauheni, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.